everyone, welcome back to another episode of Stories of Us. I'm your host, Sri Pinamreddy. Today, I'm here with a very special guest, Ishaan Shah. Ishaan is the founder of Stolen Dreams, an organization that spreads awareness about human trafficking and modern slavery. He is also an advocate for gender equality and climate change and has his own podcast, Handgel for Humanity. Hey Ishaan, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Let's talk a little bit about Stolen Dreams. What inspired you to start Stolen Dreams?
Yeah, so towards the end of 2016, I watched a documentary about child trafficking and about modern slavery and human trafficking. And I didn't really know that this was something that still existed today. And so I watched this documentary and I was seeing children across the world being exploited for things like labor and for sex as well. And originally, I thought this was an issue that's happening in faraway countries and faraway communities, so in places like India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. But actually, I found out that the International Labour Organization estimates that in the UK, which is where I live, there are over 136,000 slaves. And when I realized that this was an issue that's happening on my doorstep, and it's happening, in the clothes we wear and the foods we eat, in the hotels we visit when we go on holiday, I knew that this was something that I had to tackle. And then I went into school the following week and I spoke to my friends about the documentary that I just watched. And I asked all 156 kids in my year, do you know that slavery still exists? And not one of them knew that it was still a problem today. And everybody had thought that it was something that had ended when the abolition was passed in the UK in 1833, which marked the end of the Atlantic slave trade. But actually, this is something that is occurring on our doorsteps, and also we as children are at risk. And so I went onto the internet and I started researching modern slavery and human trafficking. But the information on Google and online was very harrowing. It was very complicated. And at the time, I was only 13, and I was struggling to understand, all this information that was being fed to me. And there was no platform online for young people to engage with this issue and to learn how they can take part in the fight against slavery. And so that really inspired me to create Stolen Dreams.
Talk to me a little bit about why these numbers are so large and why, even though these numbers are so large, so many people are not aware about this issue.
Yeah, so I think, especially when it comes to kids, we think that, when we get given clothes by our parents or by our friends, and when we get food on the table, we often think that these products are made by machines in factories.
Right.
But I don't think we understand that every single product has a very complicated supply chain to it. And this is something that I like to talk to young kids about, especially. And I really dissect the whole topic of businesses and supply chains and supply chain management, especially I speak to children aged 7 to 18. And so explaining that to a 7-year-old is quite challenging. And you've really got to water it down. And, you've got to explain to them that just to make a t-shirt, there are, tens of processes involved, picking the cotton, cutting the fabric, putting the fabric together, delivering it to your shop, the people even selling it to you in the shop. And at any point in that supply chain, slavery could occur. And so that's why people aren't really aware of it. In terms of why it's happening so much, there is a demand for labor in all the industries that we have today, and especially in the fashion industry, which is the second most at risk of slavery. And that's because of the fast fashion movement, where we are constantly demanding and wanting to buy new clothes, every week. And that's something that young people especially are, culprits of, because we see a new fashion trend and we immediately want to copy it. And we just keep buying and buying and buying and buying. But we don't realize that actually there are men, women, and children who are, forced into these factories to make the clothes that we wear. And so, and even for sex, for example, as well, that's just down to, human greed, I guess, right? And our own desires to, pleasure ourselves. And the cheapest way and the fastest way of doing that, and way to do that and make money as well, because the human trafficking industry actually earns 118 billion pounds every year from illegal profits, which is a huge sum.
Yeah.
And so the cheapest way to do that is by recruiting or kidnapping or luring people in with the false promise of a better life.
Yeah, that's definitely, in a way, it's traumatic to hear those numbers and those statistics. But a lot of people believe that change will usually happen through political measures. So has there been political measures to kind of cut down on these issues, or is that why you started Stolen Dreams and why you want the next generation to be able to solve back for these issues?
Yeah, so you're definitely right in saying that policy and government intervention plays a huge part in tackling slavery. And governments are starting to respond, but the response is very slow. And I guess, the term slavery, and because it's associated with the history and enslaving history, has been really awful. And it still is awful today. And governments don't want to really associate themselves with, the reality that slavery is occurring on their doorsteps. And so actually the UK, France, and Australia, they are the three countries that are leading the way in terms of government policy. And so the UK established the Modern Slavery Act in 2015, which basically it tells companies earning over £36 million in profits every year to produce a statement which addresses how much slavery they have in their supply chain and what they're doing to tackle it. But it doesn't go much further than that. Government policy across the globe, it wants businesses to be transparent, but it doesn't follow up with any accountability. And so that's where we have a real problem. And also in terms of trafficking, when a trafficker will traffic someone, they do so by using psychological abuse and a lot of threats. And that's really detrimental in terms of mental health. And when you have the rehabilitation process after you rescued a survivor of slavery, they have gone through so much psychological damage that reintegration back into society is really difficult. And right now, the only support they're getting are from NGOs and all these nonprofits out there, rather than the government themselves. And we're seeing that a lot during this period, COVID-19 period, where governments are neglecting those type of people.
Yeah, and I was going to also ask, do you know how COVID-19 has been affecting this entire supply chain? Has it increased the amount of modern slavery and forced labor required, especially because it's so hard to get labor right now? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so there's two sides to this. The first side is, so modern slavery is a very hidden crime. It's quite hard to, you don't go outside your door and, spot it straight away. It's happening behind closed doors. It's happening in the hotels, in houses on your high street, potentially. And so the lockdowns that have been imposed in all these countries mean that there's no escape for survivors, right? They're locked in their houses. They can't go, nobody can see them. And so that means that, people are at risk. And also people are being laid off jobs, people are not earning any income. And that's making people economically vulnerable. And especially in places in the UK, even in places like India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, where people are desperate for an income to simply survive. They are going to look for, they're going to be lured in by traffickers who are preying on this vulnerability. And they're just going to accept any job, really. And that's really, really putting people at risk. And then you've got the online side, which is especially, we as kids, we're spending a lot of time online on social media. And traffickers are using that to their advantage, and they're using social media to exploit children, especially for sex. So in the UK, the government knows that there are at least 300,000 sexual predators online who are targeting kids during this period, which is shocking to think. So that's one of the things that I've been putting out on my social media a lot in terms of making sure kids are staying safe online, and parents are monitoring their kids online as well, which is really important. And then you've got the side, which is that all these factories are closing down. Which means that workers who are potentially being involved in slavery aren't earning any sort of income anymore. And so this is what makes slavery such a really complicated problem, because it's very deep rooted. You have issues like poverty, war, climate change, and now this global pandemic that are affecting people's livelihoods, and governments aren't there to protect them. And that is one thing that a lot of organizations, international organizations, are trying to push governments to, especially in places like India and Bangladesh, where workers are now not in work, they are far away from home, because they often traffic from different countries and from further in rural villages, and they're not receiving that support from the government and in terms of having an income.
So as young people, it often sometimes we are hesitant to join social issues and bring about social change because we're often caught up in our own problems. But why is this an issue that is so important for us? And also, what are ways that we can better engage and solve back for it?
So this is an issue that's directly affecting us. We're encountering it every day, indirectly and directly. It could be your parents going to the offices, and in their offices, the cleaners there are hired by a third party, and they have actually been trafficked from Eastern Europe, for example. It could be that, the Zara top you wear in the morning to go out, that is made by slavery. When you're, feeling a bit peckish and you go and get that Cadbury's chocolate, Cadbury's actually is child slavery in a supply chain. They force children in Indonesia to pick palm oil for their chocolates, right? So this is an issue that we're encountering every day. And so that is why it's really important that we take a stand and tackle it. And I always like to fill this conversation about modern slavery, which can be very depressing and very dark and very harrowing, with as much hope and compassion as possible, because actually we can all play a part in tackling this issue. And there are 4 ways that I like to get young people involved. And the first is to educate yourself about the issue and spread the word. I think education is that, and raising awareness is that fundamental that starting point when tackling any social issue. And so I think that's really important. You don't have to become an expert on modern slavery. I certainly am not, and I'm learning new things every single day. But just really understanding that this is an issue that's close to home, and then spreading that word to your friends at school, to your family members, and letting them know that actually, despite the fact that we're all at risk, we can do something to tackle this issue. Then my second piece of advice would be to stay safe on social media, and especially now more than ever, we need to be doing that. And that means don't talk to people that you don't know. Definitely don't meet people in person that you've met online and that you're not familiar with. And also in terms of, I'm talking about explicit content here, so like nude photos. And I think we as young people are heavily involved in sort of that industry, in sexting and sending nude pictures to each other. And I actually read an art, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Snapchat.
I am, yeah.
So we as young people often think that we send a snap and 10 seconds it's gone, it's disappeared. But I actually read an article a few weeks ago that said there are over 100 different ways that the receiver can like screenshot or duplicate that picture without the sender knowing. And so we as young people are always thinking that we send a snap photo and, you know, that's it, it's gone. The person looks at it, it's disappeared. But actually, you know, whatever you post online, whatever you're sending to people, it's there forever. So really, really be careful. And traffickers will often use that against people, especially young people, in terms of you're sending someone and traffickers will pose as boyfriends, girlfriends, business professionals. It's not like your typical, you know, you're walking down the road and somebody kidnaps you, right? This is happening. Traffickers are very smart nowadays. They are luring young people in in a very clever way. And we've just got to be aware. So that's my second tip, which is to stay safe on social media.
Great.
My third tip would be to write to your local government representative. So here in the UK, we have the different boroughs and we have different MPs for each borough. So definitely writing to your local government representative, letting them know that this is an issue that's occurring on a local level, but also telling them to adopt some sort of strategy or some sort of framework to help survivors on a local level. And that could be from educating this issue in schools, in local schools, and training emergency services to spot the signs of slavery, but also having that really robust support network for victims of trafficking, survivors of trafficking, when they come out and, you know, they're facing these really detrimental mental health issues, including anxiety, PTSD, and really making sure that there's a support system in place for them so that that reintegration process is very smooth back into society.
Right.
And my final tip would be to be a conscientious consumer. And so I've been talking a lot about ethical clothing on my social media, but ethical clothing nowadays is very expensive. You know, compared to the fast fashion industry like H&M, Primark, Zara, all of those cheap clothing, low quality cheap clothing. And I feel really bad when I tell people, you know, one way to tackle slavery is to buy ethical clothing, but people can't afford that. I can't afford ethical clothing all the time either. Right. And so I don't like people feeling guilty that they can't, you know, buy ethical clothing and they have to buy from companies that are using slavery. So one thing I would say, and especially for young people, is that you've got to really understand that there were people making your clothes. There wasn't machines. There was people who are forced into factories. In Bangladesh, there are kids being forced into factories to work 60 hours a week for very little pay. And so really cherishing each item of clothing you get, right? And not wearing it once and then that's it. Wearing it multiple times, really getting the most use out of it, passing it down to your siblings, to your cousins, to your friends, your families, buying secondhand clothing. All of this really helps. And also another really fun activity I like to do on social media, and especially on Instagram, is I like to go onto all these different companies who use slavery. So we've got H&M, Zara, Primark, even designer companies like Chanel, Versace, Superdry, Sports Direct. There's a really long list of all these companies. But going onto their social medias, onto their Instagram posts, and then commenting, asking them questions like, what are you doing to tackle slavery in your supply chains? How much are your workers paid per piece that is produced? And what that does is that puts pressure on that company, but it also, you've got thousands of people looking at that one post. And so that engages loads of people from across the world in the conversation that actually slavery is occurring in supply chains of, you know, the businesses we see on the high street. So yeah, those are the 4 ways I would definitely get young people to get involved in the fight against slavery. Yeah,
and I was thinking a little bit more about your first point on education. Like in America, we have the option to take a class called AP Human Geography. And that is the only time where we ever discuss or talk about the effects of modern slavery or the effects of sex trafficking in our world. And I was thinking, are there any other resources or ways that as like young people we can get more educated about these issues and learn a little bit more? Because I often assume that a lot of resources might be traumatic or explicit. So what are some good resources in your opinion to get educated and learn more about this issue?
Yeah, definitely. So you're more than welcome to look at my website, which is especially targeted at kids.
Mm-hmm.
But Anti-Slavery International, they're a great organization. They have a lot of resources for kids, especially. In America, there's an organization called Red Light Rebellion, and their Instagram page is amazing because it goes through, in terms of America, sex trafficking for minors and children is a huge problem.
Right.
And so this organization, Red Light Rebellion, they provide content which is really engaging towards young people, and it's really fun and really uplifting. It's really informative, and it's all targeted to young people so that they can really learn about sex trafficking in a way that it's not, it doesn't scare them into thinking that, oh, now I shouldn't be on social media at all, or,
right.
When I go out my house, I should be really careful about where I'm going and things. But it fills that conversation with a lot of hope, and they go into schools as well to teach this issue. But another thing that I've been doing is I've been going to different schools and actually talking to the kids there about slavery, because in the US it's different. You're learning about modern slavery and trafficking, but in our curriculum in the UK, there's no mention of it.
Oh,
and
wow.
we learn about the history of slavery in terms of the Atlantic slave trade, but there's nothing about the fact that slavery is existing now. And we have no lessons about business supply chains, nothing like that is involved. And so really going to these schools, and even if you see a gap in terms of any topic, it could be climate change, plastic pollution, gender equality, mental health, just go to your school and pitch it to them. And I'm sure that in some way or form, you can implement it into your curriculum.
Got you. So moving a little bit on to other issues that you've also discussed, and one of them being gender equality. And I guess, what is the significance of having male allies into the feminist movement? Because there's a lot of radical feminists who are no, only women can be feminists and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So what is your response to that? And what is the significance of having people like you with us?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the word feminism and the way men associate that word feminism, I think there's a huge misconception, because feminism is the equality of the sexes, and it's not saying that it's equal and fair opportunity. So it's not saying that men are better than women or women are better than men. It's keeping them on an equal level. And I'm not sure whether it's the media or whether it's peer pressure or people's ignorance to the issue, but I think when you mention the word feminism to a group of men or to a group of boys, they immediately think that it's women trying to take over the world.
Right.
And so that's the first thing that males have to understand, is that, it's actually empowering men and women. It's actually wanting equality of the sexes. And that's the first thing. The second thing would be that boys and men, we're growing up thinking that we have to be the toughest and the strongest and the bravest people possible. We have to, provide for families, and we have to be the ones who, go out our way and do these incredible things, right?
The toxic alpha mentality.
Exactly. And it's locking us into a cage, which I like to refer to as toxic masculinity.
Right.
And I think that sort of incentive is planted from a very young age. And whether that be, forcing boys to conform to the society and, do football, for example, or to go to the gym constantly, and keeping, the girls away from that, and keeping girls into more, the playing with the dollhouse or learning how to cook, that sort of thing.
Right.
People think I often exaggerate that, but it's happening. It's happening, in places like India and Bangladesh and Nepal, where, girls are denied education. In Pakistan, millions of girls are denied education every day. But it's also happening in the developed world, right? In places like UK, the US, Canada, it's happening. And I think that is all being taught from a very young age. And that's where the root of the problem is, on a local level and starting on a very family orientated level. Really dissecting those, the gender stereotypes, unraveling them, and allowing them to mix. Because, men are growing up thinking that we have to be, brave, strong, but actually, you can cry, you can be vulnerable, you can be weak, you can fail.
That's right.
And I think, in terms of feminism, or what men need to do for feminism, I think it's just breaking those gender stereotypes, understanding that each of us are different, no one's the same. And there's no sort of, the definition of masculinity isn't strong, brave, and successful. It is empathetic, it is humble, it is respectful. That it has no boundaries, that definition.
That's absolutely right. And I already think that social media and having people like you talk about it, and other people and influencers, has already been breaking down those stereotypes. But I can definitely relate to the point about it's really family oriented, and it's built up from day when you're born. If you have a girl, you get your girl pink clothes and the best dollhouse. If you get a guy, you get blue clothes and football and sports stuff. So it's definitely, like you said, dissecting what we're doing as the child is growing up. So both of these issues about gender equality as well as the like modern slavery, they're in a way rooted in like systemic discrimination. And I'm not sure if you've heard about the George Floyd incident that's happening in America. Have you?
Yes, yeah, I have.
So I know this is a very touchy subject, but I guess what is your perspective and insight on how to kind of solve back for discrimination and be more aware and be more better citizens? Because there have been like a lot of violent protests, like literally 1 hour away from my home. There's been like the CNN
Wow.
center was like broken down and everything. So it's like, what is a way that we can peacefully advocate for equality and not necessarily become violent?
I think we've got to understand that this discrimination against the Black people is not their problem. It's not, we can't step back. We have to join in.
Right.
We have to, we stand with them. We mourn with them.
Right.
We want this to change. And this is not a new issue. It's not something
Right.
that, has happened in the past few years. It's just that more people are on social media and people are recording it, so people are seeing it more.
Right.
And this is an issue that is, it's awful. When I heard about the killing, I watched the video as well. And
Yeah, me too.
I just had no words, because it's really, as a young person, it's absurd to think that this is happening, that one human can do this to another human based on their color. And that's one of the things that I really struggle to cope with in terms of modern slavery and human trafficking. And one of the challenges I still face today is the emotions that overwhelm me every time I see a story or every time I see a post about it. The fact that one human can do this to another human. And we as young people, we often think, oh, well, I'm not a boy, so why should I stand up for women's rights? I'm not, I'm not Black. Why should I stand up for, Black lives? I'm not at risk of slavery. Why should I stand up for, attacking slavery? And I think we've got to get rid of that mentality, because ultimately, we are one. We are, together, we are all human. And, one person's problem is also our problem. We all have friends who are colored. We all have friends who are white. We all have friends who are, we're all human. And it's really that support that we need. And in terms of I've always been a follower of Mahatma Gandhi. And so non-violence is at the center of my life. And so when these violent protests happen, it's just a reaction to, the troublesome society that we live in today. And I think whilst I don't really like violent protests, I think that it's just, a consequence. We've got to deal with it, and we've got to support each other in this.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Now, I know we just had like a very serious conversation about discrimination and equality and all that, but like shifting more towards you and your perspective, talk to me about like a meaningful experience that you had that like kind of changed your perspective about things. It can still be about stolen dreams or something else.
Yeah, so from a very young age, we've always been taught, my sister and I have always been taught by our parents and our grandparents, that we live in a very privileged world. A very privileged life we have. We have a roof over our heads, we have food, we have meals 3 times a day, we get to go to school, we have an education. And so I was, in 2015, I went for the first time to India, and I visited slums there. And it's one thing seeing mass poverty on a news article or on a picture on social media, but actually being there and speaking to the kids there, that changes your life. It's
right.
And I don't want to sound cliche and say it was life-changing and things like that, but it genuinely, your perspective changes completely, because the kids that are living in those slums, they have like one room to share between 7 to 13 of them. They have, in terms of their sanitary products, not have very much access, no fresh water. And there's one school in the middle, and even then some of them are not allowed to go, because they have to, the girls especially have to stay home and learn how to cook. There was a girl who's 14 years old who was going to be married to a police officer.
Wow.
Really seeing that, really just, something hits you. But despite the hardships they face, they are the most happiest people I have ever met. They are the most giving people I have ever met.
Right.
And, when that comes to the definition of happiness, in terms of, you don't need anything to be happy. You don't need anything to give to others, right? You can have nothing and still give selflessly to others. That really changed my life. And from that moment, it was almost like I knew that the direction of my life would be towards serving others.
Yeah. I had a very similar experience. Like you said, it's like one thing to know about these issues and one thing to like witness it like firsthand. So a couple summers ago, I would travel to the Dominican Republic, which is like a small Caribbean island, right below the United States. And I guess my experience was I was shocked about their healthcare system. Basically, there is very like prevalent diseases in these developing nations, and that has been known. But there was this one disease called like helminthiasis, which is like a parasitic worm disease, and it actually affects about like 1/6 of the world's population, which is ridiculous. That's like billions of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my problem why I was so frustrated about it is because if you're infected with these parasitic worms, is that you're constantly tired, you're constantly having diarrhea, anemia. That means you can't focus in school, you can't go to a job, you can't earn money. So it kind of made me realize like a lot of the problems, if the government invests more healthcare access, it could be a little bit better for their country to go. But a lot of these developing nations, they only spend about like 1%. And the other hard part of it is that pharmaceuticals here or anywhere, they're accessible and they're very cheap to make, like maybe less than like 50 cents in US dollars. But the price, like spike of the price is so high. So it's kind of like realizing, like talking to these people and realizing that even though they have so little, how so optimistic they can have, like you said, it definitely changes your perspective about happiness and how you can lead your life.
Wow, yeah, definitely.
So I think, what do you think are good qualities of a leader?
That's a great question. I think I actually did a speech to a group of 11 to 18-year-olds in terms of selflessness and giving to others. And one of the points I touched upon was leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a leader has to be someone who's empathetic, someone who understands others' viewpoints,
Right.
someone who's respectful of those viewpoints as well.
Mm-hmm.
But also one of the things that I touched upon, which is something that people often disregard, and they say like, they always talk about leadership and listening. But I sort of twisted it and I said a good leader is the last to speak, rather than good at listening, because listening can mean that you can listen and you can like sort of interrupt, that sort of thing. But I think what makes a good leader is someone who's the last to speak, and that involves listening to every single person's opinion. And I think that's something that I found is really helpful in terms of my social impact work. And that's getting different perspectives, and because different people have different ideas, different perspectives, and your idea may not always be the best, even though you think it may be. And
Right.
so listening to each person in your team's, if you're doing a pitch, for example, listening to each person's advice or each person's pitch, or whatever it may be, really considering that first, then you being the last to speak. I think that's really, really crucial. Because there could be something that someone else said that completely undermines what you were going to say.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or something that someone else says that gives you a whole fresh new perspective. And during that time while they're talking, you suddenly come up with something that's even better, or
Mm-hmm.
something that's more productive. And I think rather than being a good listener, I think learning to be the last to speak really helps in terms of being a good leader.
Yeah, and actually in terms of this podcast and creating it, I think I've learned the lesson of being the last to speak or being a listener, because you always want to focus on the guest and learn the most from your guest. Like you can ask them anything and they will usually respond to it. And before this, I was a very, very talkative person, but it's like really important to learn the value of listening and learning from others as a leader. So I can definitely relate to that as well. So let's talk a little bit about destigmatizing sex and all that, because I think especially in the Indian South Asian culture, it's a very tough topic. So
Yes.
why do you think it's important for parents to discuss sex at such a young age?
Yeah, so when I say the word sex, people often think of the act and the intercourse part.
Right.
But actually, actually there is a whole network of topics underneath sex, and that could involve relationship, sexuality, consent. And I think when you go to parents and you go to schools and you go, okay, let's teach kids about sex, they're often a bit wary at first. But actually what I found is you can teach sex from as young as 1 year old, right? Because sex involves things like consent. And when you've got a baby, for example, and they're asking, even simple things like asking permission before, or letting your kid know to ask permission before they sit on someone's lap, that's teaching them consent. That's teaching them boundaries. And even at such a young age, that can make a difference going forward. And so it's really important to have those open, honest, respectful, and healthy conversations about sex with your parents. And I fully understand that it's an embarrassing and awkward and sometimes a bit odd topic to speak about with your parents, that's something that we've got to destigmatize. That's something that we've got to like counter. And it's difficult more with teenagers going into schools and then telling a teenager, if you've got to start talking to your parents about sex. It's harder to get them to do it. It's easier to start at a young age and really build up that healthy relationship from a young age to when they progress and become adults. But yeah, as you were saying, it's like the South Asian community hits a block when you talk about the topic of sex. Definitely.
I'm still waiting for my parents to talk to me about it. So, yeah, I guess it's my problem with it is like it is so heavily stigmatized that most of the information that you ever learn from it are from school, if your school has health classes, and then your friends. And that might not be a best source of learning information, like you said, about consent and like sexuality. And so what do you think that, like, how can parents approach this discussion, especially when it's so heavily stigmatized? Like, how can they kind of go over that barrier and sit down with their kids and talk about it?
Yeah, so if you don't talk to kids about sex and they grow up, they will discover porn. They will discover that industry. And that is where they will learn how to respect women, how sex should be, how they can pleasure others and themselves. And that's wrong, because porn gives you a distorted reality, right? And it is detrimental to someone's mental health. Watching porn gives you the wrong image of how women should be treated. I'm talking about boys especially. And in terms of porn and human trafficking, Pornhub itself is very unregulated, and there's a lot of cases of human trafficking, sex trafficking, and also child rape on Pornhub. There's hundreds of cases that are known. And so, if you don't talk to your kids about sex, they will find porn, and that's where they think that's how women should be treated.
Right.
Yeah, they don't know any better, and that's not their fault. And Jim, I'm not sure if you heard of Jamila Jamil. She's amazing, and she's one of my role models. And she said learning sex from porn is like learning how to drive from watching The Fast and the Furious, which I love. But yeah, porn is detrimental, and parents need to start talking to their kids from a younger age, because you don't learn about porn from your parents, but you learn about porn from your friends, right? And that's at school where it usually happens. And so it varies in terms of parents and how old their kids are. And I've written a detailed guide on my website. It's under the tab Talk About Sex. And it goes through each age group and how parents can start. So from a young age, as I said, letting your kids know about boundaries, asking permission before you sit on the lap or before somebody touches you, letting young kids know that people shouldn't be touching them in inappropriate ways, and that they can say no. And then as you get older, really talking about how porn is a distorted reality of life, and how each person is pleasured differently, right? And having really those comfortable conversations about pleasure and about the different types of sex that you can have, really destigmatizing it and making it a conversation as normal as asking how was your day, right? It's like really normalizing the topic and really making it something that you don't feel ashamed of, you don't feel embarrassed of. And also in terms of sex, there's like the whole sexuality type of things, right? Letting kids explore their sexuality, letting kids, not getting them to conform to the gender stereotype of society. Exactly, yeah. So it really depends on the age of the child, but from 0 to 18, it's doable. Right.
And this is again like going over. You have done like so much stuff. You've done work on like stolen dreams. You've done work on like you advocated for a lot of social issues as well. I just imagine like how are you able to like balance your like social activism and advocacy with like school and life and other stuff? Like how do you balance that? I need help.
This is a question I always get asked, and at first it was really tough. It was I especially with making a website, I'd never done that before. So I was coding a website, and also all this information that I was getting off Google, I couldn't understand. It was really harrowing, really difficult, and I had to water down that content for young people to understand. So I was bombarded with all this information. And on top of that, I had my schoolwork. I was swimming a lot then at the time. I had a lot of extracurricular activities to do. It was really sort of difficult at first to balance it. And then I made a timetable. So definitely having a timetable and organization works. But because I've been doing it for so long, the issues of climate change, mental health, anti-slavery, and gender equality, they are things that I'm passionate about.
Right.
And so they are my hobbies now. They are my relaxation time. And so people often ask, how do you balance it? And I say, well, I do my schoolwork as normal. I do my extracurricular activities as normal. And then my relaxation time, or my time to explore my hobbies, is doing this stuff. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy reading articles about, human rights. I really enjoy scrolling through Instagram and making posts or making content. I really enjoy blogging and writing. And I think when your passion becomes your hobby, when your passion becomes your life and your relaxation time, it all becomes easier then.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think another thing is sometimes this is something that I've personally experienced, especially I've been trying to make this podcast daily. So I've been having daily interviews and then editing for like 3 to 4, and then posting, doing all the social media. And I realized that it's becoming really quickly overwhelming. So I guess for me, like, how do you ensure that your passions don't become overwhelming? For me, it's been like a full-time job creating this. So like, do you have any suggestions on trying to figure out how to maintain that balance so your passions don't intrude in your life and affect the other things as well?
Yeah, so you're doing this podcast every day, and I was doing mine once a week, and I was finding that so overwhelming. So
Yeah.
I really commend you on doing
I'm
this.
like I'm trying to transition to like every other day or maybe 2 to 3 a week, but we will see.
Yeah. In terms of keeping that balance, it's really crucial to when you start and you find your passion, and what I did is I got a sheet of paper and I listed all the things that I had to do in a day. And so there was like social impact work, school, maybe if I had to respond to some emails, it could be things like eating, for example, fitting in when you have dinner, lunch, and breakfast. But really creating those boundaries from the beginning and letting yourself know that, okay, if I'm giving myself 2 hours to do my social impact work, I will stick to those 2 hours, because if I don't, it will then affect my academic work.
Right.
And then reviewing that every couple of weeks, right? Even if it's simple things as looking at your performance in class one day and say, well, actually, I did 5 hours of social impact work that night, and that day after school, keeping a diary really helps in doing this.
Right,
well.
right.
But even like the day after, thinking that, I was really tired today during school, and yesterday I did more social impact work than usual, so maybe this week, let me cut down a bit. But also making sure that you get that time to switch off completely. And when I say that my passions is my relaxation time, sometimes I become exhausted from writing, from blogging, from reading all these articles. So having that time to, even if it's, whether it be yoga, meditation, watching trashy Netflix shows, anything, having that time to yourself just to keep you happy, uplifted, especially now in this time more than ever. I think that's really crucial, having that time to just switch off from everything.
Yeah, it's absolutely correct. And kind of winding down on this conversation, talk to me about your podcast, Handgel for Humanity.
Yeah, so I was really nervous about releasing a podcast tonight because it's a really unusual time to release anything, really.
Right.
And glorify anything. But I was sitting there one day. I've been wanting to release a podcast for a few years now. I just haven't had the time, or maybe it's because I was being a bit lazy. But
yeah,
I wanted initially this podcast to focus on human rights. But then this global pandemic came along, and I thought, let me focus it on things that are going to do with mental health. And so I released this podcast as a way to uplift young people, to provide them with positivity, some tips for this lockdown period, but also just to give them company for a period of time. And my sister actually came up with the name Handgel for Humanity. We were like brainstorming names, and she said, oh, what about Handgel for Humanity? I thought that's great, because one of the things I talk about is perfection, and we're all relying on Handgel now more than ever, but we have been relying on it for years and years. But Handgel only kills 99.9 or something like that % of bacteria. So it's not perfect, just like no one is perfect. And so that was sort of the deeper meaning behind the name of the podcast.
Wow.
But yeah, I released it because it focuses on mental health. It focuses on things like body image, getting your goals, how to keep motivated, not putting too much pressure on yourself during this time, because we don't have to come out of this pandemic learning a new skill or creating a business. We just got to try our best every day. And a lot about social media and how, our bodies are our own, and our bodies are enough. We are enough as we are. We don't have to be pressurized by our peers, by society, by all these dieting adverts that we're bombarding with.
Wow. That's actually really good that you kind of started for like humanitarian purpose, hence Handgel for Humanity. For me, it was a little bit different. For me, I was kind of having like an existential crisis every other day, because I'm like, I'm applying to college next year. I have no idea what I want to do with my life. I had a pretty crappy year last year. So it's like, I thought maybe asking other people for advice and seeing how passionate and determined they are can help inspire me to do better for myself. But in a way, a byproduct of that has been like, it's been inspiring not only me, but also others. It's not been only keeping me sane during this pandemic, but it's also given others company, like you said. So it's really great initiative. About the podcast, what were some initial setbacks that you had to overcome, or that when you were starting to create? Because I definitely had anxiety trying to put myself on blast, because I never really interacted on social media that much. So it was like, talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the challenges initially was during this time, young people especially, we're finding it hard to stay motivated.
Right.
And we're all human. And I go through periods where I was feeling really unmotivated as well. And these conversations were actually the highlight of my day, speaking to different people.
Right.
They kept me company for that, half an hour, 45 minutes of me talking to them. And that I didn't realize how hard it was going to be to make a podcast.
Right.
I sort of underestimated it completely, because
me too. Completely.
I would record the episode and then I would spend hours trying to edit it. And I didn't know what software to use. I didn't know whether it was going to sound okay. There was all these anxieties running through my head. And then what happened was I released the first episode, and there was this really great engagement towards it, which I was really pleased about. And then so one of the challenges was balancing my online schooling, which was really difficult because they were providing us with a lot of work. I often say that I've done more work this lockdown than I have in the past 3 years.
Wow.
I've been setting up so much work. And it was all the social impact work. I was reaching out to a lot of local councils, making sure that they were providing support systems for those at risk of domestic violence and modern slavery. There was all these different factors going. And then there was the fact that on some days, I just wasn't motivated. I just couldn't be bothered to get out of bed and edit a podcast.
Right.
And so that was one of the issues. And I was releasing one every Sunday. And so it would often be that on the Sunday or on the Saturday the night before, I would suddenly have this burst of, motivation almost, and I'd be sitting there editing it. So that was one of the main challenges to overcome for me. But also finding, I wanted to talk to young people especially, and people who would provide advice and company for young people. This was a podcast aimed at young people. And I think really getting that message across to young people that we don't have to put pressure on ourselves to do anything during this time. We've got to, use the unfollow button on social media to our advantage and fill up our feed with as much positivity and things that make us laugh and smile as possible. Really getting the message across that we've got to just survive this pandemic. That's all the government's asked, to survive. Nothing more, nothing less.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ishaan, for your time. I've gotten so much insight, and this is a lot of fun to record.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this last episode with Ishaan Shah. He is genuinely such a compassionate, educated, and intelligent individual. He truly cares and is so passionate about all the social initiatives he advocates for. So make sure you check out his work at stolendreams.co.uk. And additionally, take a listen at his podcast at Handgel for Humanity, where he has discussions with other changemakers and inspiring people. Let's transition into our big three discussion. The big three for this episode with Ishaan for me are being conscientious, education, and balance. Let's first talk about what being conscientious means. It means that you're not only aware about certain social issues, but you're able to act upon the information that you know from these social issues. The perfect example for this is when Ishaan discusses about fast fashion and ethical brands. Now, this is something that we are all guilty of. We buy clothes and we might not use them for the long term. But being a conscientious citizen means that we're educated that a lot of these big companies like H&M and Zara, they oftentimes use forced labor and the modern day slavery system in order to make the products of our clothing. The way that we should respond to this is probably turn to more ethical brands. But like Ishaan said, it's not always affordable for others. So being conscientious means that based on the information, we're more likely to keep our clothes and only buy something for the long term, rather than just simply discard and buy more clothes. Another thing is that acting on something that you're passionate about. Now, there's many social issues, and a big thing is like, why care? There's more problems that in my life that I have to address before others. But a lot of these social issues are being acted upon right now. I think one of the most important thing that's happening now in America is the George Floyd incident and the responding protests that have been occurring. We're becoming to realize that a lot of these social issues are no longer just pertaining to one group, but rather they're all interconnected and affecting us in our everyday lives. And as a global citizen, we have the responsibility to be conscientious, act, and support these initiatives so that eventually, one generation, they can overcome such negativities. The next thing is on education. Now, education and conscientiousness go hand in hand, but it's really important to be educated about these issues because the more information that you're able to learn from others in the sources, the more likely you're about to act upon it. And by education, I don't necessarily mean talking about what's happening at school. Like Ishaan said, in the UK, there isn't necessarily a curriculum that's talking about fast fashion and the entire supply chain of businesses. But it's important that we seek education and seek new knowledge. This is not only applicable for us in our future careers and stuff, but it's also going to make us a better citizen because the more aware we are, the more likely we are about to have more engaging discussions that may bring about change in the future. The last one is balance, and you guys know I ask the balance question to almost every single person that comes in the podcast. And although each one of them may have their different way of balancing their lifestyle, a similarity that I found between all of them is to necessarily write down all of your priorities. Now, this is something that Ishaan suggested as well, keeping a diary of what is most important to you and making sure that your passion is going to be something that doesn't necessarily intrude into your other life and more important things like academics or something, but it's still there to make you happy and make you feel purposeful. And this is something that we are still going to be working on and still gaining more knowledge because every way that people maintain balance is different. So it's important to recognize that maintaining balance for what you're passionate about is important so that you don't eventually burn out. Ultimately, I thank you guys so much for listening into this podcast and supporting this entire initiative of Stories of Us. As always, thank you for your stories.